Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for coming back. Thanks for coming for the first time. What we'll do first off is review a little bit about what we talked about last week. And we took a look at our definition of grief. Grief is normal and natural reaction to loss, and grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So that opened up for us the definition of grief, and we looked at other things that we may not have thought that caused grief, like moving. We talked about getting married. We talked about COVID. We talked about graduation. We talked about things that change our behavior, our familiar behavior. Those are also grieving events. We took a look at, or we're going to take today a look at some myths around grief. Myths are based on a kernel of truth. All right? So we all know Bigfoot. We all know mermaids. We know space aliens. We know on and on about myths. There's that kernel of truth. Somebody saw something at one time, and then the story expanded. Maybe what they saw was used to explain something else. So let's go back to the beginning then. In 1958, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross moved to the United States. Her study was on patients who received terminal illness diagnosis. She studied that population. In 1969, she wrote a book called On Death and Dying. When a person is diagnosed with a terminal illness, that person goes through stages. At that time, she talked about 5 stages. But these were meant to be a loose framework when talking about grief. They were not meant to be the end-all be-all. In fact, her son has continued the study, and he's now seeing maybe 10 to 13 stages of death and dying for people with terminal illnesses. What this study was supposed to do was begin the discussion of grief, the grief that terminal patients feel. Truer title for her book might be The 5 Stages of Grief for the Dying Patient. Those are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Her focus was on end-of-life care. But we as a people, it's very easy for us to categorize or label things. We want things in order. So please understand that most people, when they're doing grief, when they're in their grief, are not going through those 5 stages. They don't start with one and move to the next and move to the next. There are similar emotions with folks that are dying and those of us that are grieving, but similar doesn't mean it's the same. Similar emotions don't mean we're in stages. We tend to apply the concept of stages to other aspects of human emotions. Please don't regard grief, which follows all loss, in terms of stages. You don't need to complete one to go to the next one, right? The nature and intensity of the feeling caused by loss relates to the individuality and uniqueness of the relationship. We talked about that briefly, that the intimacy of the relationship and the duration of the relationship causes the intensity level of grief. So if your checker at Safeway you've seen once a week for 5 years is no longer there, there will be some grief there. There will be some, it's a change of behavior, but it may not be a real strong, intensive grief. Does that make sense? Okay. There are, however, common responses to grief. So when we're all grieving, thank you. We experience reduced concentration when we're grieving. We feel a sense of numbness. That's different than shock. Shock is all emotion at once, pounding on you. Numbness is absence of any kind of emotion. It's a state where your body can reset a little bit, maybe protect itself a little bit. We have a disruption in sleep patterns. Either we're sleeping too much, we're not sleeping enough, or we switch back and forth. We might have a change in eating patterns. Either we eat too much, or we eat the wrong things, or we don't eat enough, or we're going back and forth. We're binging, we're not, we're back and forth. There's also a roller coaster of emotional energy. Now, emotions cover that gamut of good stuff, happy stuff, to sad stuff. So it's one thing after another, after another. Those are the common responses to grief. They're not stages. You don't have to start with reduced concentration and work your way through. There are no absolutes in grief. There's only one truth, and that is all relationships are unique. Okay? We touched on that briefly when I talked about how my brothers, I have an older and a younger, we're all 2 years apart, how we grieved differently for our mother. The intensity was different because our intimacy with our mother was different and the duration was different. Every relationship is unique. So we talked about that. So let's talk a little bit about some myths about grief. One of the things you may have heard when maybe you lost a loved one, or you lost a job, or something happened, is don't feel bad, be happy. There's a song about that. Whatever his name is. Another myth might be to replace the loss. And I have to share what happened when I did this. My older son, our older son, dated exclusively through high school and the first year of college with one young lady. They had planned their future together. They had arranged their college education around each other, and then she dropped him their sophomore year because he was too nice. Okay, that's a little sarcasm, sorry about that. But he came to me and he was sobbing. He's almost 20, 180 pounds, and he's just curled up sobbing. And I said to him, there are more fish in the sea. Maybe this wasn't God's plan. I was encouraging him to replace the loss with something else. I didn't acknowledge his grief. I didn't listen to him. I pushed him out. Another myth that we have is grieving alone. And we may have heard this as children. If you're going to cry, go to your bedroom. What happens is we as a society are not comfortable with strong emotion. So we tend to avoid it, or because we want everybody to like us, we back off. If I'm going to be crying, sobbing, and it's an ugly cry for me, you'll have to know that, I'm going to go to another room. Because I want you to like me and accept me. I don't want you to see me at my worst with this makeup streaming and this blotchy eyes and the runny nose. Another myth we have is just give it time. Time heals all wounds. So you break your arm and you sit there for a week and then you sit there for 2 weeks. How's that healing going? Is that working? Or you get a flat tire and you pulled over to the side of the road so it's safe. How long do you wait? And what are you waiting for? Are you waiting for the tire to reinflate? How long does that take? 10 months? It's not the time that heals, it's what we do with the time. All right? It's what we do with that time. Here's a good one, and I see this a lot. Be strong for others. Disregard your own grief, but you're going to be strong for other people. I see that in the caretakers. We step forward and take care of someone's other problem or help them with their grief, and we don't deal with our own. Here's another one. Keep busy. Stay active. All of these work in the short term. They are helpful. They're like a little Band-Aid. But what they are is a distraction from our grief, from the emotion. Have you heard anything else similar? When you maybe lost a loved one, or you lost a job, or have you heard anything else like that?
What I run up against the most is don't feel.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, no, we need to feel. We have to feel. That's what's healthy is feeling.
Why is that person saying that, do you think?
Because they're so uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's their own.
Yeah, they're just very uncomfortable. These sayings, while helpful for the short term, are like painting a wall with a hammer. You'll eventually paint it, but it's the wrong tool for the job. The job is action and what you do with that. So our mind only has access to what we have learned, what we've heard in the past, what's been demonstrated to us. That information that we've learned is then stored with importance attached to it. It's attached because it's important. So if we heard all the time, don't feel bad, or be strong for others, especially if a parent or a guardian or an authority figure said that to us, that must be important. So we're going to remember that. And that'll be our go-to feeling when something happens. The mind's job then is to believe whatever it has stored away, and remember we store it by importance, that whatever we've stored away is right. Because we've heard it enough, we've seen other people model it, it must be right. So what do? If you are a friend of a griever, I should ask, are there any questions first about that whole thing? Concerns?
I studied in the 70s, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. I was wondering if you were going to mention, because all these years, you can observe going through the stages, other people going through the stages, yourself going through stages. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go through every stage, but it always gives me some sort of awareness that there are stages to go through, and the person might be somewhere in this stage. You can kind of predict
those stages.
It just kind of gives you an awareness that this is what.
Awareness.
Yeah.
Those stages are particular for people diagnosed with a terminal illness. So, my mother died. I did not go through anger. I was relieved. I didn't deny, there was no denial that she died. I was sitting with her when she died. So automatic acceptance. But I was not angry. I did not try to bargain with God about her life. I didn't go through those stages when my mother died. I grieved, absolutely. I'm sad, but I'm also relieved for her and relieved for myself. I don't have to make that travel every week. Those stages were very specific, and Kubler-Ross went on TV. She wrote on and on about those are not stages for general grief. They are specific for terminal illness. Okay? But there are similar emotions that grievers have. And you don't have to get through one emotion to feel the next. You don't have to accomplish, you don't have to, how do I go about this? Sometimes those emotions hit you all at once. There's not a stage where you only feel one thing. It is helpful for us as a people. We want to be able to be logical about things. We want to use our intellect and figure things out. Grief is not about the intellect. Grief is about the heart. How your heart is doing, how your emotions are doing. Yes, we know that people will die. But how we feel about that. We know that our job will end. How do we feel about that? How do we come to grips? How do we complete that emotion then? So Kubler-Ross and her son both were adamant that there are no stages to work through with grief. Only for terminally ill patients. Okay? Does that help at all?
Now, I was just curious what you were going to do with it, because
That's all I'm going to do with it, because it's not true. It's only true for a small, minute group. So if my dog dies, I'm not going to go through those 5 stages to get there. What I have is all those conflicting feelings about that change in pattern. I no longer have those 4 feet patting around in the, and the hair everywhere. And the grief that comes with that is the conflicting feelings. And they could be good feelings as well as bad feelings. It's not all negative. Grief is that mix, that jumble. So, any other questions?
Yes,
Yes.
if I can comment.
Mm-hmm.
Got a long history of things to grieve about, from military through failed marriage, to my second wife passing, and long-term cancer. And my dad, my mom, and my wife all died within 1 year. And to treat those differently is like my mother and my father, I could accept very well. They were in their 80s. And
Okay.
I'm sorry that I shouldn't say
No,
ages, but they were,
I'm close to that, so yeah,
I
go
am
ahead.
too. But it was such a difference in the grief scenario. I couldn't understand my wife having to go. She was young, very young. And yet, here's my mom and dad. They have also passed. Shouldn't I feel as bad for them as I do my wife that
No,
passed? And no, you can't.
you can't. Because those relationships that you had with your mom and your dad and your wife were different.
Right.
They were different.
But what? I had a call Thursday. I moved back up here from Tucson just a couple years ago. And a friend of mine down there, he called and said his sister had died.
Mm.
And I'm, from last week when I picked up your book, I'm in reading these things of what you should not do.
Mm-hmm.
I could not find in my heart or in my mind where this is explaining to me, what do I say to this guy?
Mm-hmm.
Because he says, Gary, he said, it's been horrible. He said, my sister's died. What? Because you took away all these things that are said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I was lost. I really didn't know what to say to him.
yeah.
How do you resolve that? How do you find out the right word? Because like everybody's different.
Everybody's different. Every relationship is different. Good point. What do you do? What do you do if with a friend?
The only thing
So I have a couple things not to do, and then I'll tell you what to do.
Okay.
And Janet said right off what to do is listen. That's what a griever needs the most, is just to listen. What you can't resolve his grief. He has to resolve his own grief. He has to complete his own relationship with his sister, take a look at it from all different kinds of angles, and resolve that. All you can be is a heart with ears. Just,
That's what it ended up being.
That's-
I said, I'm sorry for your loss,
yes,
you know, and that's about all I could.
that's all you could do. But you could also say, I'm available whenever you want to talk.
Yeah.
Is there anything I can do for you? Those are things you can say. Don't say, I know how you feel, because you don't know. You may have also lost a sister. You may have been in a similar situation, but the intellect part is the fact of similar situation, but the emotional is what's helpful, and you don't have that same relationship. So you can't say. Don't be afraid of his feelings. If he can't talk and he just wants to cry, or if he wants to yell, or if don't be afraid of that. Don't back up from that and say, oh, I gotta go. Sounds like you're having a tough time. Why don't you do that alone? Blah, 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 blah. We are very uncomfortable as a society when confronted with deep emotional, painful emotional feelings. Don't change the subject. When someone wants to talk about their grief, don't change the subject. If you do, the implication is that even though the loved one is no longer suffering, the griever shouldn't suffer either. And the griever's suffering is not important. Oh, let's talk about the weather, or let's talk about cars, or whatever. Don't change the subject. Stay with it as long as the griever wants to stay with it. And don't shift from the emotional to the intellectual. And so that's what you found in the book. Those statements are intellectual. Yes, there are more fish in the sea. Yes, there's a silver lining. Yes, God's plan will be revealed. Those are intellectual things, but what your friend is going through is the emotional part of it, right? The grief is emotional, and we're not often taught how to work with that. Really listen. Grieving people want to be heard, not fixed. Grieving people are not broken. So listening is very important. Just go ahead.
I'm looking for some answers here. I'm not here to make this all about me. I've got things that's happened that I would really like to get resolved, because two people that were very close friends had come to me shortly after my wife had passed, and their wives at that time, they were within years apart, but one was up here in Oregon, one was in Tucson. And they asked me, because they were on their deathbed, if I could go counsel them. I said, I cannot. I'm sorry, I can't do that. And I know it crushed them. And I had, why are you asking me to do this? And because you handled it so well with your wife. And wow, I mean, I don't have words I can go in there and share with them. I would be a total wreck and only make the situation worse as far as I was concerned.
Yeah, because you're not done with your own grieving.
Exactly.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question.
Have you talked about the airplane yet?
No, please talk about the airplane.
So the first thing that occurs to me is what you did was a boundary. On an airplane, before the plane takes off, they always remind us that in the event that the cabin loses pressure, masks will come down, and you need to put your own mask on before you can help anybody else. And that's what boundaries are about. You have to have air, you have to have breath, you have to take care of self before you can take care of the next person and the next person and the next person.
Yeah.
Airplane being such a good example. If the cabin does lose pressure, and you're so busy putting masks on everybody else, at some point, you will lose consciousness. Those are called boundaries. It's called self-care.
And you said you cannot resolve his grief or their grief. They have to do their own work. So what's important then is to know good resources. Immanuel is very blessed with the pastoral, is that the correct word? Staff. Pastoral? In times of, in difficult times, Pastor Leah, Pastor Immanuel are good resources, good first stop resources that we have available here. They know how to work with people in difficult times. They also know other resources that are available. One of the things that the pastors might do is suggest Stephen Ministry. Stephen Ministry is lay people within the congregation that are trained in listening skills, aren't they? That's the biggest thing. We are trained to listen, to give you feedback, not to solve your problem, but to walk with you through the difficult times. It's a one-on-one, confidential, as with pastors, confidential relationship for as long as needed. We also have in the area Salem Pastoral Counseling. It's a group of, do you want to talk about that?
I can.
Okay.
It's where I work.
It's where you
Salem
work.
Pastoral Counseling Center. We have 26 counselors.
Mhm.
We're a non-profit, and so we don't turn people away who can't pay. We have a program that allows you to pay a copay, and then we'll match it. So it's another great resource. Like any place, we tend to get full, but there are wait lists and there are always openings. So.
And they cover all kinds of areas, not
Yeah.
just one specific. Support groups, and we shared a little bit beforehand, we talked about support groups like AA. That is very helpful for some people who are having difficulty with addiction. It's not for everybody. And support groups that are specific for a particular kind of loss or difficulty are helpful. Postpartum depression, loss of a child, suicide. They are very helpful, but not always, but what tends to happen is it's a repeat of stories. Over and over again, the same story. Hi, my name is, and I am, and this is what happened. So my final resource, so I was in that boat. I had my resources and I set them out for you to take a look again, but I needed something that took simple steps, not easy steps, but simple steps to resolve grief. I was in the midst of COVID. I needed something. There weren't COVID support groups. I was feeling grief, but didn't really know what to do with that. So I did find Grief Recovery Method. And what it does is it takes a look at first what we know, what we think we know about grief. Takes a look at the myths, the things that we've practiced, and then resolves or completes relationships. Grief centers around relationships and how we complete that relationship. It's an 8-week session. It's confidential, as all the rest of these resources are. We commit each week to being confidential, to being honest about the emotions, about the events. We don't need details about the events. And we commit to every relationship is unique. And what's interesting is that when people kind of grab onto this, they go, well, how do I get there? How do I get there? It's still several weeks away. We'll get there. We're going to do those simple steps. We're going to take a look at our whole loss history, not just what brings us into grief support group, but our whole history. Then we're going to take a look at which of those losses do we want to work on first. And I went in wanting to work on COVID, and I ended up working on something that happened 23 years ago, which I thought I'd gotten over. Big girl panties. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and moved on. But that's what I worked on. I took a look at the emotions with that. So I was a teacher for 22 years. I wrote the grant. I had just written the grant. It had been approved. I went to a teacher conference in the summer, and I was introduced to my replacements. I had no knowledge that I was being replaced and that my contract was not being renewed. My job was being moved to Eastern Oregon. I didn't know that. I wasn't given the opportunity to go to that. I had no job. Our oldest boy was a senior in high school, getting ready to go to college. That cut our income in half. I carried the health benefits that cut out all health benefits for both of our boys, my husband and myself. That's the relationship that I worked on. That's the one I moved to first. So it's kind of interesting when we take a look at our history of losses, which ones, and we build, don't we? We have loss after loss after loss, and we have to move on with something. But we're moving on, we're not resolving, we're not healing. So I'm a little biased, I guess, but I would recommend a grief recovery group to be specific about which loss you want to work on. What's good about this program is after the 8 weeks, now you see, there are 3 or 4 or 5 other ones I want to work on. We have an alumni group that only takes 4 weeks that goes to the next loss that you have. We'll work on that. Then you can come back to the alumni group and we'll work on that. And we'll work on that. It gives you tools for looking realistically, looking with your heart, truthfully, at the relationships that have caused grief or that we grieve. Any other questions? There's no easy fix, but you have to do your own work. You have to do your own work. You can't solve it for anybody else. That doesn't mean you're not compassionate. That doesn't mean you're not a caring individual. But the best thing you can do, as Janet said, is listen. Is listen. Okay, thank you for coming. This is the end of grief. Well, you know what I mean. Next month will be a whole series, I think, on medical. Let's talk medical. Audrey, are you involved in that?
I'm not one of the presenters, but yeah.
Okay. Okay.
What about medical?
I don't know.
What they've been through lately? Or?
Well, it has to do with what they're involved in medical and how they share their faith, how they maybe decided to go into medicine. I don't know if it's question and answer for medical problems. I don't know. I don't know who's first. But it's this was Let's Talk About Grief. The next one is Let's Talk About Medical. And then it'll be something else in November and something else in December. That's kind of the theme for this year is Let's Talk About.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, you may.
I would say that this has been an answer to prayer. It's something I've prayed for Immanuel, in that, like, we're a wonderful community, and yet I've always felt like when it comes to addressing pain and difficulties that we tend to lack. Like, we're really good at putting on a good face on Sunday.
We sure are,
And
we sure are.
and I feel like you introducing this method to the church has been an answer to prayer, because it allows us to say, you know what, we're not all okay. We've got stuff, and we've experienced loss, and we're hurting. Thank you.
You're welcome. This program is a secular program, but it does not take away from faith.
Yeah.
I think it really folds in nicely with Stephen Ministry.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, it gives the Stephen Ministers another tool for dealing with difficult situations. Because loss may, when we talk about faith a little bit, faith is not based on reason. Loss may cause a shattering or a shaking of your faith, or it may cause to strengthen your faith. But loss of faith is also something to grieve. And this system takes a look at that and how to rebuild faith if that is a loss in your life. Okie dokie.
Thank you.
I don't know if that does any, oh, it's this stuff. Okay. So there are some things along, so I do have some Stephen Ministry flyers. I do have a song, and I know you're musical, so I know you like that. It was a song that was brought to my attention.
Thank you.
Okay. You're a musical person? So if you're interested in Stephen Ministry, those two names, my name is Patty, and then Mary Miller was in here. You know a little bit about Stephen Ministry.
Yeah.
You do too. Do you want one of those? You've got them. Mary or myself, Mary Miller was in last week. We have Stephen Ministers available, willing. Everything about Stephen Ministry is confidential. We don't even know, as other Stephen Ministers, who's the caregiver and who's the care receiver. We don't talk names in meetings. So that's always important. That's being confidential. Makes for safe space. And bless your heart, my prayers are with you in your situation, with your friend's situation. You handled it very well. Very well. And if you know of resources in their area, if they ask for that, you know, grievers don't need advice so much as just being listened to. Just being listened to. Okay?
That
Yeah. Yeah.
thing is, the whole list, I could check off just about every single one of them.
Yes.
And I'm sure most of you could too.
Yes. Every single, well, I used it with my kids. It was just something, and I come from a German background, so you know, you pull yourself up with the bootstraps and you shoulder on, keep a stiff upper lip. That's English, I guess, not German, but. Yeah, and I don't believe our parents did us a disservice on purpose. It's what they knew. It's what they